It's really a pleasure. Do you want to
Thank
introduce yourself and just tell people a little bit about who you are and your background?
you. Sure. So I am Justin Clardy, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Santa Clara University, where I work on ethics, philosophy of love, and social and political philosophy. Um, yeah, I'm from Los Angeles. Always got to represent my hometown. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. Author of Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous. I guess I have to start saying that now because it's a thing. So yeah.
Right. So, I mean, maybe we should start with that. A lot of people, I think that monogamy is the norm, it's the default, and we'll probably define our terms and say what makes something a monogamous relationship and a non-monogamous relationship. And there's different kinds of non-monogamous relationships, as you've discussed, so we can talk a little bit about the different kinds. But
Mhm.
arguing that it's okay to be not monogamous is kind of a soft claim. You sometimes have gone farther and said maybe there's problems with being monogamous. So I want to cover that whole spectrum of thought over the course of this interview, going from maybe the weaker claim, it's okay not to be monogamous. There's other ways you can live an ethical and fulfilling relational life with other people. And then maybe we'll
Yeah.
get toward the stronger claims, which is maybe there's certain things about monogamy we should be more critical of, and we shouldn't take it as the default, or maybe shouldn't even approve of it in certain cases. So let's
Yeah.
start with
Yeah.
the weak claim. Why should we think it's okay not to be monogamous?
Man, I think that we should think that it's okay to not be monogamous, because the common arguments that are on offer for rejecting non-monogamies, I think all come up short. I think that they fail in sort of very crucial respects. Um, and I think a part of the reason for that is there's typically a narrow focus when we're talking about non-monogamies. We automatically go to cheating, adultery, and sort of relational violations that we should have some large consensus on as sort of being wrong and impermissible, right? But what happens more times is that in people's arguments, these very narrow, really bad examples of non-monogamy get expanded, right, universally to cover all non-monogamies, and such to say that any non-monogamy, right, is a version or a variation of this kind of non-monogamy that involves manipulation, that involves lying, so on and so forth. And I just think if we pay a little bit more attention, carve out some of those differences, some of those variations, we kind of see that, well, non-monogamies exist relationally really similar to monogamies. And if we have sort of like these permissible claims that uphold and support monogamy, perhaps those can be extended to sort of these more appropriate examples of non-monogamy. So yeah.
Sometimes in the popular discourse, you'll hear people refer to ethical non-monogamy, and I guess what they're trying to do is to distinguish that from kinds of non-monogamy that seem more rooted in abuse or manipulation or
Yeah.
breaking promises that you have an obligation to keep or whatever. But it seems to
Yeah.
me you could say the same thing about monogamy. There's ethical and unethical ways to pursue monogamy, assuming that monogamy is permissible broadly. You know, you could have a relationship in which you agree to have sex with one person and you don't have sex with other people, but you nevertheless abuse your partner in other ways. Well, that's
Mhm.
an
Yeah.
unethical way to be monogamous. So
Absolutely.
you mentioned monogamies, which is interesting, kind of a plural term. Let's start with
Well,
saying what monogamy is and what monogamies are. You know, there's different ways to be
yeah.
monogamous. So walk us through that.
Yeah, good. I mean, and I think on record, there's a lot of different takes on what monogamy is. I mean, some people talk about it etymologically speaking and sort of say, no, it means one spouse, right?
Hmm.
Literally sort of relegating the term of monogamy existing within side of the institution of marriage.
Right.
Whereas in sort of like our more common everyday language, we use monogamy and monogamous to refer to relationships that maybe are what we might think of as marriage-like, but they don't participate in the institution of marriage. And so we should think about, well, how does this term fit, so on and so forth. I understand monogamy as being sort of a set of beliefs that romantic relationships or relationships that exist in a romantic mode. And I think that there's a lot that can be said about how is this romantic mode established? Is it some sort of a priori essence to a particular kind of relationship? I kind of tend
Mhm.
to think it's more of a social convention, right? We come together, we make certain agreements, we say certain words, and then bada boom, bada bing, we're partners.
Right.
And so, I think that around that convention, monogamy has a certain set of beliefs around it, particularly involving exclusivities, and sort of what their partners are able to do and are not able to do, what they themselves are able to do and not able to do, for the sake of preserving that relationship. But, I think the central tenets of that belief system involve that romantic relationships are dyadic. Right. I think that they're made up of two and only two people. I think it's also that those people cannot have what I've identified as emotional affairs, or sort of like violate emotional exclusivity requirements.
Mhm.
And they also can't have physical affairs or violate, physical restriction requirements for the relationship. Um, yeah, and I mean, there's a lot other little stuff about like attitude dependency and this other stuff, but I think that that kind of more attaches to relationships and not just monogamous ones. So we don't really have to bother
So
ourselves with that.
yeah, I mean, let's talk about this. So I think a lot of people, when they hear monogamy, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is a certain kind of sexual exclusivity. And I just want to
Yeah,
flag that even
yeah,
that has some ambiguity in it, because some people say, well, what counts as violating sexual exclusivity conditions? If I kiss
absolutely.
someone, does that count as cheating? If do I have to have sex with them? And by sex, do I mean penetrative sex, or
Yeah,
can other things count as sex, and so forth? But then,
yeah,
there's this other thing that, as you alluded to, I think a lot of people have a sense that there are emotional intimacy conditions, and that's
absolutely.
quite striking because, friendship is an example of an emotionally intimate kind of relationship. And we tend to think that even if we are in a monogamous commitment, it's okay for a partner to have friends with other people, to be friends with other
Yeah,
people, to have certain kinds of emotional intimacy. But usually we don't want them to have emotional intimacy with people who we think might possibly become sexually involved with them. Is that right?
yeah,
Or is it a general kind of feeling that emotional intimacy is just between us, and maybe there's even certain kinds of friends you shouldn't have?
yeah. So I do think that's right, and this is where it goes back to sort of thinking about monogamies as themselves existing on this spectrum, because I think what we're likely to see is that there are some instances of monogamy that exist in all of the ways that you've described. Right. I do think that some monogamists have these conditions on who their partner or who their partners can befriend, and the kinds of friendships that they not even the kind of friendships that they're comfortable with, and also the kinds of things that are appropriate to discuss amongst one's friends, right? You shouldn't
Right.
be talking about sex with this person, even if you're not having sex with it. It's just an inappropriate conversation to have
Mhm.
amongst your friends, so on and so forth. But then there are sort of some weaker versions of that where people can kind of be okay with their partners having friends, as you've mentioned, so far as that friendship doesn't cross these sort of physical boundaries, right? I don't think that as it is in the world, monogamies perfectly embody one or other. I think that it is a spectrum, and we see sort of like a couple of different varieties of um, these presentations of it, I should say. Um, and yeah, I mean, we going back to an earlier point that you mentioned, thinking about some varieties of monogamies being things that we could also widely agree on as being unethical. I do think that the kind of possessiveness and control exhibited in relationships, where monogamous relationships, where one partner is in fact controlling who their partner can befriend and the kinds of conversations that one could have with those partners. I mean, sorry, with those friends. I mean, I think we'd all kind of raise an eyebrow, right, and be skeptical morally about the quality, right, of this monogamy, even, right. And so, yeah, I
You know, the
appreciate you talking about
that's an
that.
interesting point you raised, because monogamy can sometimes be thought of as a kind of possessiveness, and that you feel you have an entitlement or a claim over how the person may or may not behave with others. I
Mhm.
think it can be sometimes hard to distinguish where you cross over from an acceptable form of monogamy into something that's controlling and abusive. And I think
Yeah,
partly, if you're in an abusive relationship, it can be easy to mistake it as a kind of love. Wow,
yeah,
this person loves me so much that they want to keep me all to themselves. And I think when we
yeah, 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 yeah,
valorize a certain vision of monogamy, we actually make it hard for people to tell when they're being controlled in a way that's
yeah.
ethically impermissible.
Yeah, and I think that it also blurs the line, or I don't know if it blurs the line, but I think it positions us to be able to ask questions about whether or not monogamy structurally is just this kind of thing with this entailment, right? That given, its views on specialness, given its views on belonging, right? That what's entailed by that relational structure, when done correctly, is in fact this kind of control over the other. Yeah, and I don't, yeah, I've said things in certain places that I think flirt with those ideas, right? Which I think are worth thinking about.
Yeah. So is there anything positive to be said for, monogamy? Is there a way of doing it that you think is defensible? When I talk to people about non-monogamies, they'll often say, well, I can sort of hear how there's something possibly desirable about certain aspects of that, but they'll say it's just not workable. We're all going to feel jealous, and if we feel jealous, it'll disrupt our relational dynamic, and it'll be bad for the relationship.
Yeah.
So, one is there a kind of monogamy that could be healthy and non-possessive, or is there something intrinsic to monogamy that, as you say, kind of flirts with those problematic features? And
Yeah, I do think,
yeah,
yeah.
just go with that.
Yeah, no. I think that there's some non-monog I mean, sorry, I'm so used to talking about non-monogamy, sorry. I do think that there are some monogamies that perhaps can work, and be found to be in some ways ethically permissible. And I think that for me, in a lot of ways, these would kind of be like monogamous relationships, like de facto, sort of just like, there are not these constraints or restrictions on the relationship, but just as a matter of practice, maybe a bandwidth issue, like you mentioned, right? Sort of like I have these other things consuming my time. So one relationship is all that I have time for, which is not to say the same thing as placing a restriction on the relationship that one could not, should some other connection arise, pursue that connection, right? So I do think that sort of these de facto monogamies that don't necessarily have these restrictions placed on the relationship might work. And I think that, when these restrictions, I guess, are explicitly introduced and presumably accepted by the parties, assuming that these parties are equal in coming to the negotiating table. Perhaps those might work. And I think that people arrive at proposing these kinds of restrictions based on different kinds of reasons. Some, like Jessica Fern argues in Polysecure, are rooted in sort of particular trauma histories, right? That might foreclose one's ability to, do non-monogamy in a particular kind of way, right? And I think that, the preservation of self is important. Yeah, but I think that what often happens, is socially there's like a particular kind of linear structure that relationships fall under. People in the non-monogamous community talk about it as like a relationship escalator, right? We hit these sort of milestones. We go from one mark to the next mark to the next mark, and all of a sudden we're in a relationship. We call each other partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever the case might be. But the actual parameters of those relationships have never themselves been explicitly discussed. Instead, because we live in a mononormative and a mononormative society, as argued by folks like Elizabeth Brake and others, the default assumptions in going into these kinds of relationships are that we don't necessarily have to discuss these things explicitly, because everybody knows what a romantic relationship is or means. And I think that those are the kinds of non-monogamies in particularly that position us in sort of I think, again, questionable sort of ethical landscaping.
Yeah, it occurs to me that some of the arguments you and a couple of other philosophers have raised against the presumption of monogamy isn't necessarily to be antagonistic about the very possibility of having a monogamous relationship, but it's almost to throw it off of its high horse, where it's assumed to be the default. Because at the very least, if it's not assumed to be the default, then if you're meeting somebody in a romantic context, it seems like you're going to have to talk explicitly about what are your shared values, and
Right.
is there a trajectory that you think this is on. But if we all assume in the background that unless something's really bizarre about this other person, we can just
Yeah.
implicitly move along this relationship escalator, if somebody's not on board with that, you can get a lot of miscommunication, you can get a lot of hurt feelings, you can get a lot of people saying, oh, I thought that we were such and so. So maybe
Yeah.
there's just a pragmatic usefulness to moving, decentering monogamy, so that people realize it's a choice. At the very least, it ought to be a choice rather than something that's assumed.
Yeah, I think it's a choice. I think one, and I think that that's a very sort of like intellectual point. And I think in having these conversations, it's sometimes uh, uh, equally effective to kind of point out, not only is it a choice that can be made by an individual who takes themselves to be monogamous, in expanding the frame of non-monogamies, we also can point at it as a practice that some of these self-identifying monogamists are already engaged in. For example, right, to identify as a monogamist and to exist in friendships, whereas I argue that friendships are a kind of non-monogamy, because we haven't really talked about the non-monogamous side of things and what I kind of think there. But I do take that friendship is a kind of non-monogamy. I think that being single is a kind of non-monogamy. And I think
Mhm.
that even people who sometimes self-identify as monogamists find themselves engaged in these practices. And I think so beyond just a choice that can be made, it's sometimes more effective to point out that we've actually made these choices in other areas of our lives that seem to go reasonably well.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about non-monogamies pluralistically because we talked about the different forms of monogamy. So maybe we should
Yeah.
talk about the pluralistic ways of not being monogamous. I guess if you have this very strict view that a romantic partner should be the one who intellectually and spiritually challenges you and fulfills you and meets all your emotional needs and so forth, then you could get this kind of controlling situation where you think even having other friends is somehow threatening to this
Yeah.
dyadic universe you want to create with a person. But let's
Mhm.
assume we're in I don't know, the more mainstream view of monogamy, the view that says it's okay for you to have other friends just so long as you don't sleep with them.
Sure.
Why would you consider that a kind of a non-monogamy?
So why would I consider a relationship where
Well,
they
yeah, friendship as being an instance of
uh,
non-monogamy. Yeah.
good, good. Okay, so for me, I think of monogamy as this belief set that has that comes complete with this set of restrictions that you cannot have any other relationships of this particular type, right? Any kind of positioning one finds himself in or relationship that one finds himself in that rejects that premise, I take to be a non-monogamy because I take non-monogamy to be a privative concept. It sort of shows like a negation of monogamy, right? Um, and so insofar as friendships are uh insofar as I take friendships to sort of lack this sort of set of restrictions, the good friendship I should say, to lack
Mhm.
this sort of set of restrictions around it, it to me is straightforwardly, a kind of non-monogamy. We typically have more than one friend, and when we don't have any friends perhaps, we also think of pursuing friendships in the plural, and hopefully can satisfy those pursuits, and wish that for our friends more times than not. And there are these really weird instances. People sometimes say, well, what about best friends? Because best friends, you only can have one of those,
Right,
right?
right.
That's what it means to be the best. But yeah, I mean, I think that, again, communities in practice have demonstrated that sometimes there are more than one best friend, and people sort of modify the language of best friendship, particularly amongst queer folks too, right? Like this is my, shopping best friend, or this is my, gay best friend, or this is my, childhood best friend, right? And so there are these qualifiers even on best friend that I think that complicate um, its understanding as being this sort of category that could belong to one and only one person. Um, so yeah, I think that friendships really kind of are a strong example of non-monogamies. In fact, um, you know, like you said earlier, what complicates it is this thinking about sleeping with other people, um, as if I think that argument might be strengthened if it were the case that not even strengthened. I think that I could sort of respect the argument that um, you know, it's that I'm not having sex with anybody who does not exist in this mode, right? But again, in practice, that's just not how things often go. I mean, we do have sex with friends, right? The emergent category of friends with benefits, I think, emphasizes that. But sometimes, even when we're dating, right, and haven't yet arrived at the stop on the escalator, we sometimes already have sex with whoever it is that we find ourselves connecting with, right? Um, and so that straightforwardly is friends having sex, right? And so again, this idea that friends don't have sex categorically, right? I think is suspicious, So yeah,
Yeah. So I can sort of see how if I want to behave monogamously with my partner, so it's just that I can't be bothered or I'm not interested in having certain kinds of intimacy with other people. And if my partner feels the same way and we're both kind of choosing to behave monogamously, so you could call this monogamy de facto or in fact,
yeah, yeah,
that,
yeah,
that seems right. And what you object to, though, is that if I should place a constraint on you as to how you may behave with other people,
yeah.
um, as a condition of my staying in the relationship. Now, one thing I just want to highlight real quick, because this has come up in some of the philosophical literature, is the
Okay.
distinction between being in a relationship and then introducing this criterion versus deciding whether to get close with someone. And that seems important. Like I might approach you and say we're considering dating each other. And I just find that my kind of life that I value is spending lots of time with my partner and for whatever reason, maybe past traumas, it's important for me to be with somebody who similarly is, focusing their sexual attention on me, let's say. And I say, listen, I'm only interested in getting into a relationship with you if you share this value. So let's
Exactly.
mutually bind each other to the mast and proceed on that basis. And I get the impression that you're at least open to that kind of a thing.
Yeah, because I would, yeah. Go
No, go
ahead,
ahead.
sorry. No, yeah, because I take that to be a restriction, not necessarily imposed from the outside, but one that emerges as a right. I mean, again, I think in sort of like the nomenclature, we talk about the difference between rules and boundaries, right? Rules being these things imposed from the outside, boundaries being sort of sets of parameters or contours, sets of behaviors or values that we have for ourselves that we are more or less unwilling to compromise as it pertains to preserving ourselves. So yeah, that's kind of how I see. Yeah, so yeah, I'm open to a relationship where individual boundaries are set that happen to align in the ways that you're mentioning. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe one way of characterizing what's wrong with placing these rules or constraints on somebody that you profess to love is it could be seen as a kind of disrespect of their autonomy or something like that. And maybe a way to draw that point out is to think about how we are with friends or what we might call platonic friends. So if I
Mm,
have a platonic friend, part of the love that I have for them is that I wish the best for them. I want them to do that which will help them flourish in life. And if that means having other friends too, that's something I should support. If that means that they're dating people, I should support that. So in the case of a friendship where I just have this total support, dispassionate a commitment to their flourishing, it seems that I respect them in a certain kind of a way. I want them to flourish
right.
as they are and in accordance with their values and preferences. And then
Right.
it's interesting that when we have a romantic partner, sometimes we immediately switch to something that sort of seems like less respect. Rather than saying, I love you so much that what I fundamentally want is you're flourishing as you are in accordance with your values and preferences, we start to say, I want you to flourish as you are just until you do something that triggers my insecurity. Or I
Yeah.
want you to flourish as you are just until you get a little too close to somebody that isn't me. So in a way, it seems, do you think respect is a framework that can be used to analyze why it is that we should be opposed to or in favor of these constraints?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I do think that it's a part of it. I think also consent. I think that autonomy. I think that respect is there as well as dignity, right? Sort of the good old, all of the usual suspects, so to speak, right? I think that all of those provide really useful lenses to analyze what might be wrong with monogamy. But I think that sort of like in what you've just said, more so than monogamy, right? I think it's a little deeper than that because you talk about relationships existing in the friendship mode or a platonic friendship, and then sort of becoming a, say, romantic relationship. And it would almost be like we think that whatever is happening in the process of one passing from a friend into a romantic partner, right? Something not only fundamentally changes about the relationship, but something also fundamentally changes about the role or,
Hmm.
the thing, the role that this person now occupies. And more than just monogamy, that says something more about like romantic love as a concept, right? And so one of the things I think that are important when we think about like whether or not respect is a framework through which we can kind of think about these issues, right? That's kind of us doing a sort of ethics thing where we want like a nice or a neat way that we can kind of engage at the level of analysis and so on and so forth. But I've grown more critical of ourselves as philosophers when we're wanting to make that move, precisely because it takes less seriously history, right? It detaches sort of like these concepts and tries to analyze them in this a priori way when we can find a lot out about, for example, romance by looking at the history under which it has emerged and come to be and so on and so forth, right? And so we can ask questions about whether or not the evolution of this concept allows for respect. Think about its origins, right? Rooted in sort of on my view white male patriarchy, right? Thinking of not only women but also non-whites as particular kinds of objects to be controlled, to be possessed, so on and so forth. So when I probe structural questions about monogamies, for example, it's also an invitation for my interlocutor to perhaps make reference to the history of this concept of the romantic, this concept of the monogamous, so on and so forth, right? Because monogamous is only one part of the romantic story. And that's
Yeah.
that's all.
No, I mean, that's really good. Sometimes I'll talk to people and explain that a certain vision of a monogamous two-person relationship is pretty recent in human history, and it's constrained to some
Yes.
cultures and not others, and it carries with it a lot of baggage. So for people who don't know that history, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about whatever we currently think is the norm, which a lot of people then romantically project back into history and then strip it of all its ugliness. And
Yeah,
as you say,
yeah.
kind of romanticize it. Can you give us just a more realistic picture about how did we come to think that monogamy is the default? How did we come to think that that's what it means to love someone, is to love them uniquely in a certain kind of a way and to the exclusion of all others?
Yeah. Yeah, there are, I think in the history of thought, right, a couple of different ways people go on this. I think there are some resources such as Carrie Jenkins's What Love Is and What It Could Be early on
A
in
great
that
book,
book.
yeah.
Kind of, yeah, she talks a little bit about this history. But also, uh, Stephanie Kuntz has a book
History of
titled
Marriage. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think that those resources do a fairly good job of sort of telling this story of how the romantic came to be and how it came to be associated with the sort of like a shape that we sort of believe it to have like presently. But I will say the majority of my work focuses on sort of like the American context, sort of thinking about what this phenomenon of romantic love has looked like in America across time and space. And, as we see, with other things throughout American history, the ways in which monogamy, marriage, and romantic relationships were used in decisions of, say, like citizenship or decisions of sort of economics, thinking about who gets pensions um, uh, uh, as having lost a husband in the Civil War, for example, right? If I'm a white male citizen and fighting in the Civil War and die, my family's entitled to those pensions. But if I'm a slave fighting for my freedom in this war, right, a slave who is unable to contract, unable to sort of rise to the level of recognition, state recognition, right, of their relationship, so on and so forth. Yeah, it kind of begins to sort of weave itself as a part of this larger story of, say, Black history and American history, so on and so forth. And so, yeah, by the time it had gotten to America, it was already pretty romantic, monogamous, dyadic, so on and so forth. But we do see that happening on some accounts around the late 16th century. And yeah, yeah.
Well, I'd like to dig into this point that you're raising a little bit more about how norms around romantic love may differ from context to context and community to community. So
Okay.
you talked about part of the history of monogamy is as an instrument of white male patriarchy.
Yeah.
And so that would suggest that non-monogamies would be stigmatized or disvalued or vilified within that context.
Yeah.
But the first paper of yours that I read talked about how polyamory is stigmatized even in Black communities. And so you
Yeah.
talked about the stigmatization of polyamorous African American men. So how
Mhm.
is it that even within Black communities, you have this negative attitude toward a polyamory, which might seem
Good.
to be resistant to that white male heteropatriarchal default?
Yeah, good. And so I think that we get help here from perhaps literatures that aren't too popular. But, I think Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask talks about sort of like certain subjects being marked Black and having an aspiration towards whiteness. I think that in other more recent work emerging from the Afro-pessimist tradition, thinkers like Frank Wilderson also talk about the way that the Black is situated in an anti-Black world, right? And in sort of the extent or the sort of pervasiveness of anti-Blackness in the world that Afro-pessimists argue we occupy. Is real, is a real thing. And so it's not that, for example, we might expect, an anti-Black world over there, but then inside my head, there is this sort of like pro-Black world. Wilderson says, for example, my head is just as anti-Black as the rest of the world, which we might expect. And I think that is the sort of emphatic point of like the depth of anti-Blackness. But politically speaking, right, given the sort of fraught history of Blacks in America, right, we might understand how this aspiration toward marriage or certain kinds of monogamous relationships is tethered to beliefs about respectability. Sort
Hmm.
of this idea that in order to fight against these controlling images that were imposed on blacks as slaves, as say hypersexual beasts,
Hypersexual, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, right. As a way of sort of combating that, right? It's kind of like, oh, well, let me show that I can do what it is that they're saying can't be done, right? And sadly though, right, this doesn't help blacks by and large achieve that kind of respectability, which I think is evidenced by how they are perpetually treated in the American context. So yeah, I do think that sort of respectability and an aspiration toward respectability, which I think might be sort of, you know, tethered to certain beliefs about self-preservation, right, safety, right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
so
I mean, the gay community had a version of this with the question about whether to pursue marriage as an equal institution,
yeah,
which would sort of inherit this monogamous standard. And there was a
right,
schism within the gay community where a lot of people said part of what it is to be gay or to be queer is to question these norms. And so the fact
yes,
that gay men, for example, might be thought to have multiple partners and that's normative within gay culture, the thought
right,
that, well, we all have to find one partner and get married and have a white picket fence and two kids and so forth was the price to pay for acceptance by the
mainstream,
dominant
yeah,
culture. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
exactly,
inheriting these norms and then trying to find ways to internalize them, because if you're constantly just playing a game with the dominant culture where you're trying to act respectable according to their standards, that's one thing, but
exactly,
you start to internalize it and you come to think of it as actually the thing that you ought to do, and then it becomes a norm within the community that now you start policing other people within the community for failing to adhere
right.
to the new standard of respectability.
Right. Yeah, and right in some ways becomes a sort of like defenders of an ideology that is responsible for oppressing you in the first place, right? Which
Yeah.
I think is odd to say the least. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's a stereotype of being a player, so that if you're a black man and you have multiple partners, the only
Yeah.
concept that's available in certain discourses is the idea that you must just want sex. You just have this
Yeah.
sort of instrumentalizing attitude toward partners, and so you couldn't possibly really love them or care for them sort of intrinsically apart from
Yeah.
this need.
Yeah.
You're trying to open up some space for other ways to conceive of polyamory other than under this player label. So how
Yeah.
is that project unfolding? Have you seen movement in within your conversations with people where people are open to your ideas of thinking about things differently?
Yeah, I think that sort of like amongst intellectuals and academics, right? People who are sort of like self-admittedly, open-minded, they do try to engage and think about it. And I think that people have thought about things differently. I don't know how many people, I don't know, for example, how many African American polyamorous men themselves have read that work. I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah,
But there is some movement, I think, in uptake in it in sort of like the academic circles. Um, and yeah, I don't really know exactly. Um, well, I should say the manuscript that I'm working on presently actually builds on insights that were first contained in that paper.
yeah.
And there's also a companion piece in the Routledge Handbook for Romantic Love, where I talk about sort of uh, how amatonormativity and mononormativity, sort of this default assumption around monogamous relationships and monogamy, impacts Black women who are polyamorous as well. And so, yeah, it has some movement, I think, in that regard. Do I think that I see it socially? Not really. I think that people still in tongue-in-cheek ways employ the term player as a way of describing
Mhm,
African American polyamorous practice, African American male polyamorous practice.
mhm.
And I don't know what to make of that. I think in social discourses, right, because it does exist among this sort of landscape of like, you can't take a joke, and it's just
Yeah.
like those conversations are really, really difficult to have, as we see happening all the time. Every time Dave Chappelle, for example, releases a stand-up comedy that, you know, uh, uh, has jokes in bad taste aimed at trans folks, right?
Mhm.
And people on the one side defending say, oh, well, you got to take a joke and, whatever. People are saying, well, no, not at the expense of me, right? Because this is
Yeah.
bringing me harm, so on and so forth. And I think that we're seeing that kind of tension uh, reflected around sort of how people use language to refer to African American male and African American polyamorous practice.
Yeah, I'm just joking. Reminds me a little bit. I was just flirting. It's like you might be harassing
Yeah,
somebody, doing something that's really crossing a boundary, and then you can retreat
yeah,
to this. It's just a light touch. And similarly, you can say something that
yeah,
really cuts to the core of somebody's sense of self or what it means to respect them, and then you just retreat to it's just a joke. And sometimes that's really a cheap move rather than like a
yeah,
legitimate response.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You've
You know,
mhm.
yeah. It's yeah, and I think I'd like to think at some point I would want to think about what is happening there, like at a philosophical level, and kind of
Yeah.
like articulate in some analytic way what I take to be the particular kind of harm involved in that, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
You've used the phrase a couple of times, a mononormativity, which is Elizabeth
yeah,
Brake's term, but I don't know if everybody will know it. Can you explain how that's different from, say, mononormativity?
yeah, sure. So a mononormative, so one, I think a very sort of like standard way to think about it is a mononormativity has marriage as a part of the set of assumptions that it makes, and mononormativity needn't.
Hmm.
And I'll say a little bit more about that. So I think a mononormativity is the default assumption that everybody wants this sort of happily ever after monogamous relationship that leads to marriage,
Hmm.
right? And that sort of gets reinforced at the level of the social, in sort of marriage magazines, romantic movies, romantic novels, conversations that we have with friends and family, so on and so forth, right? It's sort of in this perpetual process of reification. But then, also at the political level, right? As we've been talking about in some ways, that marriage only makes allowances for two people as being able to participate in one relationship.
Yep.
And so this idea that everybody wants one of those relationships that has marriage as its endpoint with that happily ever after, that gets reified at these levels is sort of this system of a mononormativity, as I understand it, and other non-monogamous thinkers. Mononormativity is similar, right? And it can sometimes be difficult to tell the differences between the two. But insofar as we can understand, say, as we started out way earlier in the conversation, talking about monogamy, we talk about it as existing outside of the institution of marriage, right? To cover these marriage-like relationships,
Hmm.
right? I think that, you know, the idea that this is the preferable relationship, a monogamous relationship is the preferable relationship, where monogamous is here understood as not needing to involve marriage, is the difference between, say, a mononormativity and mononormativity, right?
Yep.
A mononormativity includes mononormativity in societies where that marital institution is in fact monogamous, but they're not, exhaustive.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but I have a cheat code, which is I already know about the concept. So
Sorry. Yeah.
I wonder if I think that was clear for people who might just be coming to
Okay.
the concept. It made sense to me.
Okay,
You know,
cool. I'm hoping so.
So, I mean, a mononormativity and mononormativity are things that we learn from our cultural surroundings in all sorts of ways, through film and television, through conversations in our community, through listening to pop songs, which might, have a little
Yeah.
narrative that they portray, and we just kind of sing along, not realizing that we're imbibing a script, we're imbibing a set of norms
Yes.
that way. And so,
Yes.
have you seen any good representations of polyamorous relationships in film or TV or theater or anything like that? Well, often what I found when I try to explain to people about this concept is I want to be able to point to a relationship and say, look, when you hear polyamory, you think somebody who just wants to have sex with a bunch of people and it's this kind of
Yeah.
hedonistic lifestyle and has no value. And
Yeah.
then when you think of romance, you think of these stories that you can point out in film and TV, and it looks like there's this beautiful intensity between the couple, and they really care about each other. So, what's an illustration that people can point to and say, it's that kind of thing, a relationship where
Yeah.
somebody loves more than one person, and it's not just a trivial pursuit.
Good. I appreciate this question because this interview is existing like on the back of an interview I did yesterday. I have a book club called Pages, the Reading Group, and we have a
Nice.
podcast component where I did an interview there for the first time since releasing Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous, and a version of this question came up. So I'm glad that people are asking me about good representations in media, because I consume a lot of it, and not a lot of it is good.
Yeah.
But I do think I like you want to be able to have representations that I think sort of should be paradigmatic in some ways, sort of serve as a paradigm or an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And toward that end, I always recommend Trigonometry, which was a show that aired on HBO, or it was being streamed on HBO Max for a time, but it was produced by BBC, so it's a BBC
Hmm.
show. It's no longer on HBO Max, but those who are internet savvy can do whatever they do to find and access that film. There was also a independent film that I was able to go see a few years back in Berkeley, California, and it was called My Belle, My Beauty. I
Hmm.
think that tells a really interesting non-monogamous story. And then there's a movie called Superfly, which is like a more contemporary blaxploitation film. So I think it's I think it's really, really funny.
Hmm.
But yeah, the main character in there is in a polyamorous relationship. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that some of these bits of media do humanize them, or humanize sort of non-monogamous in a particular kind of way that's not just this hypersexual, everybody's having sex all the time. Um, but then yeah, there's music. You know, I've put together a few playlists where I've written actually blog components to songs that cover non-monogamous themes. I've actually collaborated with a polyamorous Black girl who is a dominant force as far as social media influencing on matters of race and non-monogamy. And so yeah, we have a list called the How Many campaign that folks can kind of tap into and sort of listen to songs again for the first time with a different lens. So I think a lot of um, uh, things that are culturally like prominent amongst Black folks, like the song "The Boy Is Mine" by Brandy and Monica,
Hmm.
which has stood the test of time. And what do we get when we look at, say, the lyrics of that song and the video? Right,
Yeah.
everybody's to assume that it's this sort of unethical non-monogamous story, but are we also sort of the boy is mine? What about that possessiveness that we're even thinking about these relationships existing in? Like, can we question that? Or, so yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about this. I love non-monogamous media, or medias that do a pretty good job. And I think sometimes that some other things are right in front of our face and we just don't have those analyses. So I think about like The Bachelor, right?
Hmm.
It's a mononormative because it does aim at this marriage thing right at the end.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I mean, for a good while, he's going on plural The Bachelor, whomever it is going on plural dates, multiple
Right. Right.
dates, simultaneous dates, right? It's straightforwardly a non-monogamy, right? And so um, I've also written on these sorts of things, for audiences that might be, consuming The Bachelor, though, yeah, I've stopped consuming The Bachelor after Matt James.
Right. So a lot of people, I think, take monogamy for granted, as we've been saying, but maybe they're interested about the idea of polyamory. And then I think there can be this transition period that's difficult. So let me explain that. I wrote about this in my book Love Drugs, where there's different ways of doing monogamy ethically or unethically, and different ways of doing polyamory ethically or unethically. And I quote a researcher in the book who says it can take like 10 years to learn how to do one of these forms of relationships and get the ethical norms and figure out how to communicate properly and so forth.
Yeah.
So if you spent your whole life learning one set of norms and you think like, okay, I know it's wrong to cheat. Okay, I know it's wrong to do this, and you've got this all worked out. And now you want to try to switch to a different model, which has a different set of norms that are going to guide you toward, good or bad behavior, respectful or disrespectful behavior. How do people make that transition if they want to start to live in accordance with a different set of norms, but they're interacting with people who maybe don't know those norms? They maybe don't have a lot of practice with those norms. How do they get there?
I think decentering learning the history of romance and then decentering that notion, because a lot of the norms that we're talking about don't just inhere in monogamous relationships, not at least in the good ones that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. They're just sort of like norms of respect sort of that should be observed, whether or not we're relating to someone romantically or even as a friend. We
Yeah.
should respect strangers in certain ways. And so
Mhm.
I try to sort of get people to think about not as accepting a new set of norms, more than reattuning oneself to the set of ethical norms that one observes for oneself, and trying to embody them the best one can within whatever relationship they are in, right? I think so. I guess in some ways, I'm saying, if we think that there's a particular ethic that supervenes friendship, if we think that there's a particular ethic that is distinct from the one that supervenes friendship, that actually supervenes romantic relationships, we should rethink that. You know what I mean? I think we should rethink that sort of disaggregation, um, and sort of see, no, we have an ethic or we have a set of moral beliefs that we try to abide by in our lives. in relating to whomever we're relating to, no matter the mode, then I don't think that transition period might. I don't know if it's that far off, right? And
Mhm.
again, it's sort of like a similar move I'm making here strategically, as pointing at people and saying, yeah, non-monogamy is a choice that you could make, but it's also one that you've made, right? And it's kind of saying, yeah, maybe you could conceive of it as, I got to learn a whole new set of norms. And I think that would not be the case for the monogamous going to non-monogamy. I think it would be more the case for the
Yeah.
unethical going to the ethical, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you've got to go. So maybe I'll ask one more question and kind of wrap it up.
Okay.
But
Okay.
one way of thinking about what you're talking about is that people often interact with somebody with a set of relationship types in their head, and they're trying to figure out, how can I fit this person into my prefabricated type? So are you going to be a
Yeah.
lover? Are you going to be a partner? Are you going to be a friend? And in that way, you're not really present to the person because you're
Right.
measuring them against some other standard. Maybe
Right.
friendship will emerge from the relationship. But I think what you're saying that's inspiring is, if you meet people and you try to think, what's just ethical engagement with another human being, which would include things like, being sensitive to their actual needs rather than what you impose on them, or, being curious about what actually motivates them rather than how you wish they were motivated vis-a-vis your interests. A lot of this stuff is just getting to know a person as a human being. And then if you can figure out, okay, cool, so let's let something organically emerge out of this, and it might include something sexual, it might not, it might include different forms of emotional intimacy, it might not, it just depends on how you relate to each other as individuals. If we can set some of those prefabricated typecast, categories that we want to shove somebody into, that might just be how we should relate to everybody in our lives.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which, I don't know if we'll have time today. We might have to have a follow-up
Let's do
conversation,
it. Yeah.
but for thinking about, why that set of restraints is as harmful as it is, because of the ways it might distort not just how you treat friends and romantic partners, but just how you're treating people, right?
Yeah.
And I think that tells some of the story of why I think, I mean, we can unpack that, like I say, at length. But yeah, no, I mean, exactly what you're saying, right? And when I hear it coming from your mouth, it sounds like music to my ears, but it also sounds like something very so mundane that
Yeah.
these seem to be, a lot of people ask me about my work and its impact, and I don't think of myself as being too profound, right? And then some people find the profundity in sort of, looking at the little things that are right in front of our face that are very simple, so on and so forth. But that's really kind of what I take myself to be doing, and sort of starting there and seeing what is entailed by that. If I, want to be a person, right, who has a particular kind of character, one that people respect and observe as sort of being kind to other people or fighting for justice, all of these sorts of things, I'm going to try to orient my life towards the pursuit of those, what some say in philosophy, virtues, right? I don't want to get into the sort of virtue ethics sort of baggage right now, um, but yeah, in the pursuit of those, I do think that um, at least with me, I've found myself able to relate in more authentic and, as you say, organic ways with folks, and being open to whatever fruits the relationships and connections that I have with those folks bear, right? And sometimes I have sets of desires or want it to pan out a particular kind of way, and it doesn't. Other times I'm not even thinking about that at all, and it does. So I mean, it's, you got to kind of, yeah. We've been
Yeah.
talking a lot of vibes in philosophy lately, so I don't know. Maybe there's some story to tell there.
Maybe we can have part two, and we'll start with a question about vibes. In the meantime, will you tell people how they can access your book? And that includes me. I want to read this as soon as possible.
Cool, cool, cool. So yes, as I mentioned, I have a book club called Pages the Reading Group. We can be found at pagestrg.com. And there we have a bookshop where you can not only buy my book, Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous, but also we have a set of creators that curate lists as a part of our reading collective. And there's a bunch of good stuff there. So I'd encourage everybody to visit there, spend some time there, pick up not just my book, but a couple of other titles. We're also Pages TRG across all platforms, so tap in with us there. As far as sort of like following me, I'm across all of the socials at Your Fave Philosopher, URFAVFILOSOPHER. I have to say because it's the F in the middle that throws people off
Yeah.
sometimes. But blame Instagram. When I created the ad, they had limited the amount of characters we could.
Yeah, you
It
got to
was
squeeze it in there. Yeah.
yeah, I was an old Instagram head. So yeah, that's where I can be found. And and also my website, justinclardy.com. So I'm looking forward to engaging with folks, man. So, and yeah, let's do a part 2.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, go off to your talk. It's great to meet you, Justin. It was really nice talking with
Yeah,
you. All righty.
likewise. Thanks, Ryan.
See you later.